What's up? Welcome back. In this segment, I'm gonna make a whole new series called my A.T.R series, right? And the A.T.R series is gonna be where I break down African traditional religions. Now I'm not gonna really teach people how to do that stuff and things like that, but I'm gonna just give backgrounds to it, and hopefully kind of help people who are seekers on the journey in the sense that a lot of people, particularly Black folks and Latinos, are naturally drawn to this because that is something that's in our ancestral religion, right? That's basic in our DNA, right? So it was naturally going to be drawn to this because it's basically part of our ancestral spirituality. And to me, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem that comes in is that they have A.T.R.s or African traditional religions in the Americas have gone through changes because when the slave trade happened, there was a lot of mixing that happened, right? Literally. So, where in Africa, the tribal breakdowns were very distinct. You know, your Igbo, your Yoruba, your Fon, your Ewe, your Akan. That was extremely your Zulu, right? That's very much like you knew exactly what you were. But in the Americas, and when I say in the Americas, from Canada to Argentina, um, the lines are blurred where most descendants of slaves in the Americas probably have two to three, at minimum, different tribal mixtures, sometimes more. And what happens is that when spirituality is passed on by blood, that can make things complicated because in Africa, some of these tribes actually didn't like each other or had beef with each other. So when you are a product of a mixture of peoples who energetically clashed at times, what happens is that either, if you're lucky, right, your DNA, it's like you become something that a symbol of DNA that just cancel each other's out. So when that happens, you really can't practice magic the same way, right? Like meaning it's like, it's like dropping a battery in water, right? Then the battery's done, right? You take it out, you dry it, you still can't use the battery. If you're lucky, right, that's your problem, right? If that's the case, you can actually still reactivate that dormant energy in yourself energetically, right? But if it's the case where maybe energy is active and they're clashing within yourself, what ends up happening is that I don't want to say you go crazy, but you can exhibit insanity, right? So it's a serious problem, and it's part of a bigger problem of globalization when not even from just mixing, right? But like mixing sexually or mixing blood or mixing physically, but even mixing culturally with others. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you mix, see, we come from a time that no culture really tells you about themselves, right? So when you look at any culture, if you're an outsider in that culture, there's gonna be things you don't know, right? Sometimes when you actually from that culture, you don't know it, especially in the globalized society where you could be a Polish American and you're a Polish person in America, but you don't know anything about Poland really. Your grandma might cook some Polish food, but you're more American than you're Polish. That goes for anything, right? So when that happens, spiritually, it can cause problems because you end up energetically, like it's kind of like you go back and forth, and sometimes basically you could be at war like with your own DNA, your own self. Like you might have an internal battle that is happening and you don't even know it. And the problem that goes with that is that, I mean, living in the world is hard enough, right? But when you have a battle going on internally, that has nothing to do yet with your overall ego versus higher self, which they can clash, right? This is a separate battle. It makes spirituality a bit tougher, right? So the worst thing is that for me, I don't mind if systems mix with each other, right? That's fine. But what I mind is that when they mix with each other and they don't know that they're mixing. So this goes into Palo. Palo is often described as the darker version of Santeria, or the darker version of Lukumi, right? Or the darker version of Regla de la Ocha, which is basically what people call Santeria or Ifa. And Regla de Congo, when it comes in, is something distinctly different from Santeria, right? So, in a sense, when I say something completely different, first off, the West African and Central African peoples had tension with each other, right? So when you look at Palo, you're talking about a system that originated with the Bantu people of the Congo region in Central Africa. It comes over here. When you think Palo, you're thinking really of a system that, as we know, it started in Cuba, right? For the most part. And then it spread, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, um, to some extent, Puerto Rico, and then it came to America. So you see it strong in Miami, Florida, and you see New York. You would even see it in Mexico, but in Mexico, when you see it, it wasn't transported by slavery as much as it was transported by immigrants coming from those regions of Cuba and let's see Puerto Rico, going to Mexico, bringing that system to Mexico, right? So in a sense, what ends up happening is that in Cuba, is what I'm going to talk about, these two different groups, the more Yoruba-based groups, West African groups, and the Bantus or groups coming from Congo, they came in and had a truce. And when they had a truce, what ends up happening is that at times they might work together, but they're completely different. And there's so much that even if you were practicing Palo in Cuba, you probably wouldn't mix them together, right? So you wouldn't really mix the rituals together. And sometimes you might have it where you might keep your Palo altar outside if you're more Ifa. And what ends up happening is that when these systems spread now to America, and people who are not from that culture might come in and um, adopt the system, they would say, oh, for instance, Lucero, right? He's kind of like the gateway force in Palo, right? That opens up rituals and closes rituals. They would say, oh, well, he's the same as Eligua. And that's where problems happen. And to understand why, because again, you only understand the differences when you treat them for what they are. They're spiritual systems that cross into religion, but it's actually a way of life. So when you practice in a system like Palo or Ifa, you're going to be completely different than than the person you were before. So it becomes your way of life. So it's very important to understand that distinction. And so what happens is with Ifa or Santeria, or if you want to call it Regla de la Ocha, basically when you're dealing with gods or forces, I don't even want to say gods, but you're dealing with forces that are like demigods, right? Meaning definitely sentient spirits that many of them, not all, if not all of them, walked the earth, right? They're now in a different plane. When they're in a different plane, they give you guidance, right? If you want to use guidance through Cori shells, whatever cards, they give you guidance, right? And what happens is that, and when they give you guidance, at times, especially if you're related to them, they give you energy, right? And sometimes you could do things that you were not able to do before. Now, I don't want to get into supernatural stuff or things like that, but just in general, right? It could be just inspired, be more creative. You might make your music more. You might be inspired to learn the language. That's why when you go to Cuba, you see that there's places where people still speak Yoruba, or they still speak the religions. Or not, I'm sorry, they still speak languages from Congo. Whereas slaves in other part of this border will look at that and say, "Wow, that's actually pretty cool." Like they actually speak their languages, their mother tongues from Africa, and the Orishas or those forces give you access to that in a sense. Like they give you inspiration to learn more about your culture, right? So it definitely ends up being of kind of like a source of pride, and it's a very powerful experience. Now, when you look at Congo and Palo, people would say, "Oh, Palo is even some Paleros or Tatas would say, "Oh, yeah, Palo is the religion of the dead," and that's true to some extent. But Palo's really religion of the earth, right? That's why soil and sticks. Palo means stick in Spanish. That's why it takes such an importance in Palo, like earth, like literally soil and sticks. And sometimes you mix two or three different soils in your altar. That happens because earth is actually basically the dominant force in Palo. And yes, the earth covers the dead, but it's much bigger than just the dead. So that's why in Palo, you would definitely get more into literally the spirits of nature, right? So it's almost like shamanism in that way, where you get into the spirits of the fire, the spirits of the water, the spirits of the earth, the spirits of the wind, the spirits of the four directions. That takes a higher precedence in Palo than it does, or importance in Palo than it does in Santeria. That's the difference. So Santeria is dealing with forces that used to walk the earth, some forces that were more human-like, some forces not. They're in a different realm. They give you inspiration. They give you creativity. They give you energy, right? They give you power. But in Palo, it's basically more of the earth. So yes, the dead is part of that, but it is much bigger than that. So because of that, Palo in some way, that's why in Cuba and Puerto Rico they would say, "Oh, Palo works faster." Yeah, it works faster because this is their realm. Number one, it works faster because this is their realm. Number two, it works faster because one of the hidden tragedies of the transatlantic slave trade is that some people sometimes may not know who they are, right? So if you go to Puerto Rico and Cuba and certain parts of the border, especially but particularly Puerto Rico and Cuba, Ifa is more Yoruba, right? Obviously, it's from the Yoruba peoples, right? But so those are the dominant African Afro Latin religions in those regions, right? But the people from those regions are actually more from Congo, so they're more from Central Africa. So the crazy part of it is they're more from Central Africa, but they practice in something that's more from West Africa. Again, nothing wrong in that because the Odishas tend to be more gentle, tend to be more light. So they don't care if you like. In their sense, they're trying to get influence in the physical world, right? So the more people give energy to them, they don't really care, right? In that sense, but of course they prefer if you relate to by blood. But if you're not, and honestly, Central Africans and West Africans are related to each other anyway. In the end of the day, as much as we talk about Congo, a lot of this stuff starts from Cameroon, right? And Cameroon is very related to Nigeria. So they're the same family in the overall scheme of things anyway, but they just evolve differently. So Palo is more, so in a sense, think of it like Santeria or Ifa or Regla de la Ocha is linking you with energies that's not in this realm. Palo or Regla de la Congo is coming from this realm. That's the difference. So when it's coming from this realm, it's gonna naturally gonna work faster. And most people who are practicing that, to me, it seems like there was more slaves really coming from Sangambia, which is a region outside of Nigeria, like west of Nigeria and Ghana, right? Which doesn't really have as much to do with voodoo and Ifa anyway, and then from Central Africa, right? So in a sense, what the Yoruba or I would even say the Ifa spirits or Nago spirits are really doing is they opened up the door for everyone to practice African spiritual systems in that sense in the diaspora. But some people are practicing Ifa who maybe by blood or energetically are more related to Congo. That's the difference, and that's a big difference. But then in a sense, it's tough because when you deal with the Bantu people or the Central African people, even when we say Congo, there's Congo, there's Angola, right? So in Brazil, they're definitely more related to the Angolans, even though Candomblé is the dominant Afro-Latin religion in Brazil, right? But there's no question, by blood, they're more from Angola. So in that sense, for me, I think Palo gets a bad rap in the sense that when people describe it as, oh, it's just the darker version of Santeria, you're kind of disrespecting the spiritual system. But even in America, when I see people now in America calling themselves Tatas and basically saying they practice Palo, but they don't really pay homage. Yes, you got to pay homage to Congo. You got to pay homage to Central Africa. You got to pay homage to the Bantu people. But you also got to pay homage to the people in Cuba and where it started in the Americas. Like when you look at Palo for what it is right now, Cuba, to some extent, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Venezuela, that's where it started and it came here. And to me, if you say that you follow, or this is your system, you got to pay homage to those people. Like for me, there might be some aspects of Palo I do with my work, but I don't pretend to be an initiate in Palo. I respect it. Like I said, I've learned a lot from Paleros, right, and Tatas. So in a sense, what ends up happening is that it actually definitely influenced my work, no question. But I always pay homage and say, no, that's where it's at. So if you're in America, and then you come in and you're like, some people are not even Afro-Latin and say, okay, I'm a Palero, right? And which is nothing wrong with that, actually, because it's all about the diaspora. I think one of the things, that's the reason why I want to get into A.T.Rs in the sense is that when you look at it from the overall level, right, from all levels, you got to realize that it's about really more these slaves and the descendants sharing the experience that in some levels they're still going through in Americas. So when people say, oh, sometimes we might be all be from Africa. People don't really realize Africa is a huge continent. There's more there's more diversity in Africa than any other continent, right? So you go from West Africa to East Africa, that's genetically more diverse than when you go from Europe to Asia. So if you wouldn't even say Europe and Asia should all become one, to say that everybody from Africa should become one is not really realistic, right? But I do think, to be fair, there's an experience that we share that's true. So for me, it's not really as much about emphasizing division, but more about understanding the natural barriers that take place. And if you want to unlock those barriers and mix together, you have to know what you're doing. When you come in and say El Igual and Lucero are the same people, the same forces, that's crazy. I mean, I can honestly say that's nuts, right? And that's why one of the things I like about Palo and Voodoo is that the people in America who don't really do magic per se, but then might try to fuse these systems with Kemetic spirituality, they don't really do that with Palo and Voodoo, right? They stay away from it. Why? Because Palo and Voodoo is more dark, and Palo, in their minds, like I don't even like to use the word dark and light, but from their angle, Palo and Voodoo are more dark, and they don't allow themselves to be overtaken. So, for instance, one of the chief things that you see in America is even when somebody's saying they're initiating Palo and the Palo based systems, right? Reglas de Congo, what you can tell when that's true, because in occultism, most systems have what they call sigils, right? In East, they might call them yantras, right? Where it's sacred geometrical symbols that you basically use to call on certain forces. When you're an initiate in the Palo-based systems, you automatically know those sigils or patabembes. You know that automatically, right? So you could tell the difference because in the Americas, there are a lot of people who call themselves paleros who don't even know how to draw those symbols. And if they do know how to draw those symbols, they know how to draw those symbols because somebody gave it to them. But a true palero can a lot of times draw a sigil, a patabembe on the spot. Like they could go on the spot and draw them like that. It's so crazy that even in voodoo, when they call them verves, right, which a lot of that stuff was actually influenced, it existed before it came to America, but when you look at it now, a lot of it was influenced by the Taino in Haiti and the Central Africans, right, from Congo. And then that influenced a lot of Haitian verves, right? Even in voodoo, a lot of the priests, they already have, every lower has their own verves, but a lot of them can't make their own verves on the spot. Then you have to take the sorcerers in Haiti, the Bocos. A lot of them can draw the verves on the spot. That's how you can tell the difference, right? So Palo is even worse because I could say, well, let me look up Eswilu and look up verve, and then you get something on the internet. But if I said, oh, Zarabanda, Sotereos, let me look up their sigils, right, or their petembembas or firmas, right, and you're not gonna see that on the internet like that. So only when you're initiated in those systems you see that. That's the difference. So Palo, in some ways, has kept itself not hidden. In a sense, you could say hidden. Like it's in plain sight. But when the reason why I don't think it's hidden because it's in plain sight. But when it's in plain sight, you make your own assumptions about what it is. And when you don't come from that culture, you make your own assumptions of what it is. What ends up happening is that you not really end up tapping into that force. So if you're in America calling yourself Palero, a Tata, and you don't know those sigils, or not even, to me, even better, you can't draw it on the spot, chances are you're not initiated in those systems. And if you are initiating those systems, you're still new. That's the difference. And because of that, the energy of Palo actually keeps itself more preserved. And because it keeps itself more preserved and kind of harder to understand, it's a lot easier to call it dark. But what it really is Palo. I always give respect to systems that connect you to the environment. For me, Palo connects you to your environment probably even better than Ifa does. So Palo, I thought it was important to just dedicate a whole video to it. Hope this helps. Till next time. Peace.